Hi, good evening. I trust all of you can hear me.
Yes, Roger, you can.
Great. So on behalf of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka, I would like to welcome all of you for today's webinar, The Role of IMF in Bailing Out Sri Lanka. A webinar organized by CA Sri Lanka CPD unit, I must say, a very timely topic. So we have allocated the time towards the end for our participants for their questions. So therefore, please type your questions on the chat section or the chat option. Let's limit it to relevant questions for the topic. So keep it on the chat, type it on the chat section to the convenience of our speaker and the moderator. So our speaker for this discussion today is one of the most prominent economists in the country, who is known by all of you, Dr. Nishan Dimel. Dr. Dimel is an executive director at Verity Research Private Limited. He completed his undergraduate studies at Harvard University and his graduate studies at Oxford University. He sits on multiple public and private sector boards and consults regularly as a strategist. And the moderator for this evening is Mr. Mohan Tantrige. Mr. Tantrige is the Vice President, Group Financial Controller at John Keells Holdings PLC, and he serves as the alternate chairman to the CPD Committee of CA Sri Lanka as well. So without taking any more time, I would like to invite Mr. Mohan Tantrige, who's our moderator, to take over. Mohan, over to you.
Thank you. I think this is a very timely, relevant topic that we are going to discuss today. Before handing over to Doctor, I thought of I'll let or rather tell something at the outset. All participants, I think we are very lucky to have Dr. Nishan Dimel to understand the current dynamic in the context of IMF bailout plan in this juncture. There are thousands of people around us. They may not have this type of opportunity, or maybe they don't have that capacity even to understand, or maybe they don't have the time and space to understand these things. I think as citizens of this country, as a part of finance and account fraternity, I urge you to spread the message and understanding these things and spread the correct message. I think what we are looking at in terms of this IMF. I think with that light, I hand over to Dr. Nishan Dimel to start the presentation and proceed with that. Thank you so much.
I think, Mohan, you're going to ask me questions, if I'm not mistaken, right? So there's no presentation, but I think you were going to ask me several questions, and I'm very happy to answer them as we go along. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Doctor, I think I'll start from the discussion I had before in terms of when I'm hearing your presentation before. There's a presentation you did at Chartered Institute in terms of integrity of the publicly available information. I can remember there's a particular point you were telling, okay, look here, when there's a transfer in between these SOEs or the debt transfer in between these SOEs, suddenly these are moved out from their balance sheets, and they are looking at different point of view. I mean, how they're going to take on to this balance sheet. In that light, Doctor, in terms of getting into a discussion of this IMF bailout plan, are we totally resolving the issue, or are we looking at a part of the problem at this juncture?
Thank you, Mohan. So first of all, let me say thank you to CA Sri Lanka for organizing it. Forums organized by CA Sri Lanka are one of my favorite types of forums to attend because they're so well organized. And Niroshi for introducing us all also. And Mohan, thank you for the questions you had thought about. And this particular one is an interesting question where you're saying, do we know the actual numbers of what government borrowing is? So the problem is simply this, that often on your budget reports and central bank reports, you get a number called central government debt. And what is considered to be central government debt leaves out debt inside state-owned enterprises, even though much of that debt could be under sovereign guarantee. So there is a real concern that the full picture is not seen till you look inside that. And there's a double problem that in Sri Lanka, the officials of the Treasury and Central Bank have seen it fit to take what is originally central government debt, say, for instance, the debt to build the Norachale power plant, the Hambantota port, the Mattala airport, and later transfer it into the books of state-owned enterprises, suddenly making it disappear from central government debt reported numbers, making it look like central government debt had come down, when actually the obligations remain precisely the same. So the book entries changed and represent debt differently. But because of that, when the IMF tries to understand the position of the government, and when Verite tries to understand the position of government, we actually, in all our material, you notice we talk about public debt, not central government debt. So when we say public debt, we look at not only what's reported in the books of the central government, but also what is in the state-owned enterprises as sovereign guaranteed debt, and we add it back in. Now, for us to do that is a lot of work because we have to pour over all sorts of reports and documents of the government. It's not easy to find that, but the government is obliged to report that number to the IMF, so they generally have it. And in any conversation about debt, it will be that public debt. So the right number will come out. We just have to struggle a little more to get it when we try to do so. So thank you for remembering that and asking that question. Mohan, you're on mute.
Yes, thanks. Follow-up question on the same thing. When you experience with the same issue, what's the form and the structure that the other governments or the other part of the world follow this kind of issue? I mean, in terms of not having, are we using the correct approach for us to do the recording, or do we need to follow some sort of a process for us to get this thing done? Because it's alarming. I mean, it's not something we can laugh at it. I think it's something very alarming. Whether there's any process that we can follow to get away from this thing, because as an accountant, I'm talking about we have to have the books right. I mean, that's the starting point for anything. You have to have the data right without having, because the moment we are having the different data at the moment, then we are not resolving the issue. I mean, our trajectory in terms of the getting the answer will move away drastically if you don't have the data. In that light, Doctor, you think whether there's any mechanism or anything we could follow for those kind of issues?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think good information is central to good management of public finance. Now, it is not unusual in other countries also to have central government debt distinct from public debt. The important thing is that it gets reported accurately and that things are not moved around between the two. So actually, the Auditor General of Sri Lanka has been very astute. And he spotted this moving around. And we first traced it from the Auditor General's reports. And he pointed out that some things got moved around too often and it got lost in translation. So nobody knew where it was. But because we studied the Auditor General's report and we went into the state-owned enterprise documents, we were able to trace the debt as well. So I think it is not a wrong accounting standard to distinguish central government debt from public debt, but it is poor practice to move things around between the two, and certainly even poorer practice not to report it properly in a way that is transparent. So as long as the data is well reported, I think that gets to solving 75% of the problem. But I'm very glad to be talking to auditors and talking about how to get the data right. And I think we need to improve the disclosure of data. Because even the government itself, the parliament, in the data that it sees on the budget, gets led astray because the information that's provided isn't well provided and isn't able to give people the discernment and understanding they need to make good decisions. So that's something Verite really cares about, that the data is available and is understandable. And I think moving for proactive disclosure of data. So we have an RTI law, which is a huge advancement, but it still takes quite a lot of time and effort to convince public officials to release data under RTI law. We have many case studies of those problems. But proactive disclosure, I think if that were part of our law, then that would really help to have government departments proactively disclose critical sets of data and help the public and the parliament make better understanding and decisions. Over to you, Mohan.
Today morning, President appointed 3-member committee to fast-track IMF discussions. In best case scenario, what type of a timeline are we looking at? I mean, to get this thing done, because there's a discussion happening on the bridging finance as well. Then in this all in all, what kind of a timeline we are looking at to get this IMF bailout package and plan ahead?
Mohan, I'm not convinced that there's a formal appointment of a 3-member committee. I think we may need to wait to hear from the committee itself before we come to that conclusion. There have been times in the past when I also heard in the newspapers that I was appointed to government committees without being fully aware that, that such a thing that had happened. I'm sure that these 3 members, one of them is actually a non-resident fellow of Verity Research, Professor Shantha Devarajan, have been offering their advice to government on request, but I haven't spoken to them since the news came out. And I don't know whether there is a formal appointment or that they have just been consulted semi-regularly as needed and have on a personal capacity always been willing to assist. I'm just not clear about it. That's all I want to say. And I usually am careful not to make up my mind on news alerts alone.
Thank you, Dr. I'm moving to participants' questions now. There's a question, in your opinion, what would be the public debt amount to be at the present?
The public debt. So we have a calculation and estimate, which is between 119 and 120% of GDP. And the Article 4 consultation concluded by the IMF recently actually came up with pretty much the same number. So we can safely assume that even though the central bank report is not out and the accounts are not finalized, therefore, for 2021, that the public debt to GDP is let's say 120%, round it off. That is a 25 or 24% at least increase in debt to GDP from 2 years ago. So the public debt to GDP calculating in our methods, and we do several corrections for it. Some of it I'm not sure the IMF does, because we even correct for the market value adjustments on international sovereign bonds. Give us a 24% increase in 2 years, which is the largest debt to GDP increase we have seen in a 2-year span. And it is also the highest level of debt to GDP we have seen in the history of Sri Lanka.
It's alarming as we speak, the amount that tips at the moment. Doctor, I mean, in terms of IMF programs, what are the austerity measures that, I mean, if the finance, if the country is in finance crisis, what kind of measures that they're bringing in, I mean, for us to, I mean, even before the start of IMF program?
So I heard you use the word austerity, yes. I think, Mohan. In a way, I mean, we need to be fair to all parties. And this is, of course, a word used constantly about the IMF. One way to think about it is if you're trying to lose weight and you go to a doctor, now he is going to tell you that you must reduce calories. And he will also tell you that you must exercise, but usually any part of a diet requires reduction of calories. So maybe what we mean by austerity measures is reduction of calories, but whether they are really austerity or how they impact the country depends on how that calorie reduction is implemented, right? It can be implemented in healthy ways and unhealthy ways. And that is I think we mustn't worry about the fact that calorie reduction is important for weight loss. We must worry about how you implement that calorie reduction. And that is where it can be, less positive or more negative. And I think that may be where we need to focus. So Sri Lanka, certainly, when you get to the IMF, there is a concern for saying in this particular instance, I mean, especially that Sri Lanka's debt is not sustainable. The debt that Sri Lanka has achieved as a debt to GDP, not only because the debt to GDP is large, because the interest cost is large. Last year in 2020, and that's the latest data we have on this, the interest cost to government revenue was at 71%. That's the highest that Sri Lanka has had, but not only, it's the highest that we can find in the world today. No other country that we know has an interest cost to government revenue that high. Lebanon had it in 2019, and of course, we know the story of Lebanon after that. So I think the problem there is Sri Lanka has to find a way to really increase government revenue. And austerity can come by increasing taxes, it can come by cutting expenditure, but in Sri Lanka's case, I don't think that Sri Lanka can afford to cut expenditure a lot, because Sri Lanka's expenditure is not high. But we may need to improve the allocative efficiency of our expenditure. We may need to spend less on some sectors and more on others. For instance, surely we need more money in healthcare, we need more money in education. And we may need less money in some sectors of the public service that isn't really adding as much economic value to the country. So it is allocative efficiency rather than total expenditure reduction that we may need to focus on. And that's also a good way to do it. So sometimes the dietitian doesn't tell you to reduce your meals, but says, look, just only eat 3 times a day, or be careful of how you pace it out, how you distribute your food intake. Don't eat after 7 in the night, right? So it's a distribution issue as well that can help you with weight loss, so to speak. And I think the IMF's measures or directions, I think that's a useful analogy to use. I won't speak for long because I'm sure you have follow-up questions on that, but I just want to park that thing that the idea of austerity can seem like a calorie reduction, but it's often not just calorie reduction, it's changing your behavior in how you actually absorb those calories as well. And the same metaphor applies quite usefully in public finance also.
Thanks, Doctor. Sorry, there's a follow-up question. What is a critical? Is it interest to revenue or debt to GDP? I mean, do we have some empirical evidence to say that, okay, look here, these are the ranges that we have to keep?
I think honestly that the cost of servicing the debt is a more important parameter than the total quantity of debt. I'll tell you why, and I'll take an extreme example. And I'm quoting off memory now. Japan has around 240% debt to GDP. Okay, there was a time when that was Japan's debt to GDP was. Now that's double of Sri Lanka's. Okay, yet their interest cost to government revenue was about 8.2%. So while Sri Lanka, having half that debt to GDP, has a 71% interest cost to government revenue, Japan has 8.2%. So you can see that that debt is really sustainable because you can carry the debt for perpetuity forever, right? As long as you're only paying 8.2% of government revenue, that's not unsustainable. So sustainability is not just about the quantity of debt, it is the cost of debt. But if you have 71% of everything you earn going to pay interest only, that does not look very sustainable. So if you had to choose between the two, you certainly should focus on the cost. Now, of course, as the quantity goes up, the cost goes up, and these are not unrelated. But I think when you focus on a single parameter, the cost of debt tells you really what the sustainability problem is.
Thanks, Doctor. I'm moving to participants' questions now. There's a question, what are the historical instances where IMF support has helped countries in debt situation as we are facing today? I mean, there's a history of IMF bailout packages. I think that's a question.
So are you, I mean, if you're saying debt situations and not just IMF packages, if we just took IMF packages, Sri Lanka in 2009 and 10, soon after the end of the war, saw record growth levels. within an IMF bailout package, right? That there also reserves came down to probably, close to 1 month. It was a precarious situation, and Sri Lanka entered into an IMF program, and 2010, 11, 12 saw record growth numbers. And actually, it was after the IMF program ended in 2012 that growth fell in 2013 to 3.4% and then picked up to 5% in 2014. So I think there is another narrative that I hear, that IMF programs are associated with lower levels of growth. I haven't seen the research to establish such a claim, and I think it's probably unclear that it is true. And Sri Lanka's own experience shows that certainly there are exceptions to that rule, even if it were empirical fact. In debt situations, I mean, almost every debt restructuring, there are very few debt restructuring instances in the world, Belize being one of those exceptions recently, where there's a debt workout without IMF assistance. Mainly because the IMF brings a lot of credibility into a negotiation process. Even though IMF is not directly involved in any negotiation, your creditors who you're negotiating with take a lot of confidence and a sense of safety, knowing that you are in an IMF program or you are working with the IMF separately. And the IMF is also able to then provide sort of their own audits and accounts that tell the creditors, this is the haircut we need to give the country if we want the country to be sustainably able to pay us back. So they become also their technical assistance, and not just the programmatic or funding that they provide, really helps to build confidence all around. So IMF, let's say, there's 3 things, just to be clear. It provides that analytical guidance that anchors perhaps a negotiation and a settlement with your creditors. It provides credibility and confidence to creditors so that they are more willing to negotiate and end an agreement and a negotiated process quickly on the basis that you're going to an IMF program. But more than that, it also provides some leverage, because effectively the IMF says, look, if the creditors take a haircut of so much, we will also provide some funding to help tide over. So there is a kind of funding gap, right, that a country has. And the IMF will say, look, by taking these behavior changes, you're going to be able to improve the funding gap so much. But we are also going to supply some extra funding from the IMF over the short term. That's going to take you to so much. And then your creditors have to cut what they get back to, adjust the gap. So the creditors know that, because the IMF is there, they may have to take, they are better off. They can get a better deal because there is some IMF assistance that makes the country sustainable. So IMF does, through its assistance and funding assistance, also leverage into the deal and provide help to the country. So all the funding, the technical and the credibility are all very useful. Okay, it's not essential, but it really does reduce the costs all around and speed up the process. Now, countries like Belize, I think it was, have entered into restructuring arrangements without the IMF, mainly because, very small debt workout, under $1 billion. So when you have 700, 800 million debt, you can have, a third party come in and do a separate deal to do that debt workout. And then it doesn't require such a, a comprehensive process. So I think wherever the debt workout is, in the double digits of billion US dollars, then it is unlikely that you can do it so easily without IMF assistance.
Thanks, Doctor. Again, the follow-up question, what is the structural adjustment? What are the economic and social impact of structural adjustment? I think you can touch upon this social impact with the safety net, whether there's a safety net, whether there's within the IMF program, whether there's a safety net for the poorest of the poor with those structural adjustments, Doctor.
So I think this word structural adjustment is an old word. Let's forget about it. That's a World Bank word. It's not an IMF word. World Bank came up with it in the 1980s, right? What the IMF does, you called it austerity earlier. I called it a reduction in calories. IMF, I mean, one of the things about the IMF historically is that they're concerned in the calorie cut. They may not always be as interested in how you cut the calories, right? Do you cut your bread or do you cut your rice? You know, they may not get into all those details. Sometimes they do. Really, IMF, especially after the year 2000, has taken a fairly proactive position that it would not, for especially countries that are poor, advocate cutting social security. They may advocate making social security more efficient, improving targeting. They often would advocate increasing social security and safety, but they do focus on the efficiency as part of their advice that I have seen on the social security side. But protecting the poor is very fundamental to the stability of the political system, of the economy, and it doesn't make sense to make the poor more vulnerable as a way of improving your economy or increasing GDP. So, but what I want to say is, you know, the way you ask the question, or the person asked the question from you, Mohan, there's this impression that the IMF tells you what to do. The IMF doesn't quite do that, I think. So if you go to look at all Sri Lanka's agreements with the IMF in the last 20 years, you see that the agreement is a letter written by Sri Lanka to the IMF, and you can download them from the IMF website. It's called a letter of intent, where Sri Lanka says, look, you know, in looking at our country and trying to work out a sustainable path of growth and, you know, balance of payment improvements, we have decided to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Okay. This is our plan. These are our milestones. And if we do this, would you give us so much funding? And we are requesting so much funding, but we are giving you a plan. It's very much like, you know, you have a business, maybe John Keel's. You go to the bank and say, well, we'd like to borrow $1 billion. And here's our business plan. You know, you should lend us $1 billion on the strength of this business plan. You don't offer collateral to mortgage all your properties, etc. I hope you don't have to, and banks are willing to lend you on a business plan. Now, the letter of intent we write is our business plan. Now, you can have the kind of strange, perverse situation where a company goes to the bank and when asked for a business plan, tells the credit officer, hey, why don't you write some business plan and I'll sign it, okay? Now, that would be rather a pathetic thing to do, but it is not perhaps, you know, it may be that some countries with extremely weak institutions, weak capacity, simply leave it to the credit officer to write a business plan to hope to get it passed by the board of the bank and then find they can't implement it. But if Sri Lanka does things like that, then I think it is our own responsibility not to do that. Okay. And the IMF, whatever that is gets into the letter of intent, LOI, should be something that is vigorously and rigorously examined and debated and thought through in Sri Lanka amongst economists, amongst implementers, to say, is this the best way we can do this calorie cut? Is there a better way to do it? You know, we still have to do the calorie cut for sure. Or find a way to drop the funding gap, get that sustainability. But there are good ways to do it, not so good ways to do it. And we need to be in that process. I must say that in the past, I haven't seen government consulting very much, or discussing or opening that out for discussion amongst economists in the country to figure out how best to put together that business plan. And I really hope this time it won't be like that, because often we get into trouble when the business plan we write is not adequately thought through and is simply written as a way of appeasing the lender without looking at its suitability or implementability. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dr. Yes, thank you. Dr. Moving to participants' questions again. Yeah, there's a question. Can we get your wisdom to see the direction of the country in wake of fast depreciation? I think their question is whether there's any light end of the tunnel. Because every day we can see 5 rupee, like depreciation almost every other day. Then they're asking your wisdom to see that there's a direction in this country to have that depreciation, or maybe we are heading at that depreciation rate?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a great question. It's a huge problem. Let me tell you, let's go back and say what is driving depreciation in Sri Lanka. We have, as economists, very good tools to calculate what is a suitable level of depreciation or a change in the value, exchange value between certain currencies, right? And that calculation is based on the inflation gap. So if the currencies that we trade with, for simplicity, I'll say we only trade with the United States. If the US has an inflation rate of 2% and we have an inflation rate of 5%, we should expect a depreciation of 3% of our currency. That's how that's a simple way to understand what the correct depreciation is. In actual fact, you do it against the whole basket of currencies of countries that you trade with, etc. It's a slightly more complex calculation. However, in Sri Lanka, the depreciation is not driven only by those fundamentals. Eventually it will be those fundamentals, but there is going to be an overshoot in Sri Lanka for two other reasons. One is, regardless of what an appropriate market-driven price is, if for some reason you create a shock and there's a shortage in the system, you're going to get a price increase. So under normal market conditions, you may have paddy at a certain price. There was a drought, production fell temporarily. There's a shortage. During that time, you may get a spike. Okay, so Sri Lanka lost the equilibrium of its forex flows when we lost access to global capital markets. We were paying debt. In the past, we could borrow most of what we paid. We could hold equilibrium, hold things in balance. Now we are paying. We can't borrow. Reserves came tumbling down. And basically, there was a shortage because the government was now only on the buy side of the market for dollars, not on the sell side. The central bank is the market maker. And the market maker has to be on both sides of the market to make the market. It can't be on the buy side and not on the sell side, or just on the sell side and not on the buy side. So effectively, by being on the buy side and not on the sell side, the central bank set up the market to have a shortage. And when there's a shortage, price goes up. There's a third reason why the currency shot up. That is, when you see a country getting into trouble, it's not only the fact of there's an actual depreciation because of inflation gap. There's a shortage-driven inflation depreciation, but now there is a risk of future speculation, expectation-driven depreciation. People begin to see reserves coming to zeros. They see that central bank has no choice, cannot fund essentials, that you may have to pay any price for the dollar when it is about keeping electricity going. They don't see a plan for the country. They don't see a future end to the debt restructuring. They don't know when Sri Lanka will come out of the problem. They think it'll get worse. So the more you think that, the more you try to buy the dollar at today's price at any price, right? And more the price goes up, and that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So negative expectations drive depreciation also. So the way to reverse it is really you get into a planned, rational process to solve the problem. Immediately, you reduce the negative expectations. You may not be able to do it extremely fast. You work that process through. You get bridge financing in between, stop your debt outflows. You reduce the shortage. And when you get access to financial markets, you really stop the shortage. And then you work out that part as well. And then all you're left with is your inflation differential. So Sri Lanka's exchange rate has probably overshot and needs to appreciate at some point. But you're not going to see that till you solve the expectation problem and the shortage problem, because the inflation gap that currently exists doesn't justify the exchange rate or the depreciation that we have seen. But it is not an unreasonable depreciation at the same time, because there is a shortage and there's a negative expectation about the future. I hope that helps.
Yes, indeed. There's a follow-up question on the same line. What do you think about the prevailing foreign exchange regulation introduced by the regulator? Is it getting the problem worse by these regulations, or is it what is your point of view of this existing regulation at the moment?
So you have to ask what the regulation achieves, right? It achieves on the one side the government's ability to take dollars from the market to pay perhaps for electricity, which might be quite important and quite essential, or pay for fuel that pays for electricity. But on the other side, it scares the market and drives those negative expectations I talked about, which then sends the depreciation spiraling forward. So, you know, it's very important that in dealing in the financial markets, you really learn not only to manage your current reality, but your future expectations also. And these have to be very carefully managed, and confidence and trust is a big part of it. So when the markets begin to lose trust in the actors and the institutions, and certainly lose confidence in the future, or they get spooked, then people behave. So the markets, you know, markets are not an actor, but it's really the behavior of human beings. People behave in a way that then makes those negative expectations self-fulfilling, and you can't blame them for it. There are many of my friends who seem to be purchasing dollars at 250 rupees, while the government said it was 200. And I said, really, are you willing to pay so much for the rupee? Surely it can't be justified. I look quite silly right now, okay, because it's selling at 300 even with the government. So I think it is reality that when people begin to fear government, people begin to lose confidence in government, that fear and loss of confidence becomes self-fulfilling. The government itself cannot handle that. So managing the institutions of finance is also enormously about trust and good stewardship, telling the truth, being believable, being credible. And part of the secret for Sri Lanka to come out of this is not just about the actions it takes, but about the credibility of the leadership that it puts before the negotiators, before the IMF, and the kind of trust and confidence that they would inspire in a serious negotiation, because those have real value.
Thanks. But in fact, you touched this particular point, but there's a question came out of, I'll ask the same question again from you. What is the strategy to apply to increase the inflow, foreign inflow? I think they're asking about the foreign inflow here to the banking system. I think that's maybe the, there's no any spot market to start with. Even though the government started forward market, but there's no liquidity even in the spot market. In that regard, they're asking that what would be our strategy should be to get the inflows to this country.
I think what I've said earlier, Mohan, just answers that question already, because, well, the problem for Sri Lanka now is with the credit ratings falling, the risk premium is high. So why is it that Sri Lanka has such a high interest cost to revenue, or generally high interest rates of 6 to 8% even between 2010 and 2019, when the United States, Japan can borrow at much lower rates? Because those markets have higher credit ratings, because they've built up higher confidence, right? And people know that their money is not going to be lost. Now in Sri Lanka, because of the way government functions, they look at your government, the stability of your parliament, your political leadership, and they assess, look at your reserves, your financial management, everything. They assess a risk factor. So you really got to bring your risk factors down. That's the way you get your inflows at an affordable price. I mean, you can get any amount of money if you're willing to pay, I suppose, 50% interest on the dollar, right? Or if you're willing to pay 90% on the dollar, you surely will get inflows. So there's always a price at which you can get it. The problem is that price shouldn't be too high. And the way, when you say, how can you get inflows, you really mean, how can I get it at a reasonable price? To get it at a reasonable price, you have to reduce the risk. In Sri Lanka, we now have, in addition to our economic issues, a political risk issue. It will be very difficult for the IMF to negotiate a stabilization program with an unstable government. They need a credible, stable counterparty even for the negotiators, and the risks premiums just go up. So, before the downgrade in April 2020, that blacklisted us. So that was the downgrade. The April 2020 downgrade, subsequent to the tax cuts in December, January, was what really shut Sri Lanka out of the financial markets. But the previous downgrade happened not in the Easter attacks, strangely. It happened in the 2018 October to December period, which we call this constitutional coup, when politics became unstable. So there, Sri Lanka took a downgrade at that point because the political stability is extremely important. So there were two downgrades. I mean, if the 2018 December downgrade hadn't happened, you may have had only one downgrade in 2019, and the fatal downgrade may have happened later because Sri Lanka did see several downgrades after that also. But that the political instability downgrade at the end of 2018 put us on the edge. And then the tax cut end of 2019 dropped us over and lost access to financial markets. So it's all about risk and reducing the perception of risk. And for banks and private banks, when your sovereign is, has a certain risk rating, it's very hard to get a risk calculation that is above your sovereign. I mean, very specialized banks that are global might be able to do that because the sovereign risk always has a feedback on the assessment of institutional risk in the system also. So I think for all of us, however much we think we are only in finance and economics, we have to understand that we are not insulated from the political risks that the country faces.
That's right. There's a question on the public debt that moved from one SOE to another SOE. I'll read out the question. Is this disclosure procedure relating to public debt being moved to SOE being the same over the last? Okay, the question is, are they asking whether this particular issue when they're transferring from one SOE to another SOE, is it a procedural issue from very beginning, or is it something that happened very recently?
Well, we kind of got clued on to it with the Auditor General's observations, and he observed this particularly in 2014. So he saw that these big projects for which the central government had borrowed, those project debts had been taken and moved into SOEs in 2014. Then, and as a result, reporting a debt to GDP number for 2014 that was substantially less than the, or somewhat less than the actual number. And then of course, in the 16-17 period, they brought it back, okay, or some of them back into central government debt. And then he realized that, some of these things had not been yet properly reversed or calculated, things like that. So these are not things that have always happened, as far as I know. But we have seen instances and countable instances of debt being moved around. But I think, this doesn't happen only in Sri Lanka. In many countries, governments try to make their books look good, especially in countries that are in difficulty, which is why it is standard operating procedure for the IMF to ignore what you call central government debt and go straight for that public debt number, which is what Verite does as well.
Thanks, Doctor. There's a question on this GDP. I think we discussed this particular matter, debt to GDP. I think the question here is because of this COVID and other related issues, our GDP obviously is reduced in the current context. I mean, is it a question of that lower GDP, or the debt is always as high as which we can't sustain?
Yeah. Well, we have run high GDP, high budget deficit. So it's really the deficit, right? So when the government spends more than it earns, that you create a deficit, and that deficit needs to be funded by debt. So it depends on how you run the deficit. Sri Lanka has something called the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, FMRA. That gives the government guidelines on how much the maximum budget deficit it can run, the debt that it can take, and set targets to reduce and bring fiscal responsibility into the country. And this was passed in 2002 over a span of time. Now, what happened was that Sri Lanka's parliament, I think, was somewhat irresponsible. That they did, you saw them doing three things. They either passed a budget deficit that fulfilled the conditions of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, say keep budget deficits to less than 5% during a certain phase, well, I don't know whether it's the parliament or the ministry, but then those numbers in the budget deficit weren't honestly set up, or the budget numbers. So actually what was implemented almost always violated the conditions of the act. And the ministry didn't go to parliament and get special permission to violate it. They violated it and came back, right, after the deed was done. More recently, what you've seen is the parliamentary passing budgets that actually violated that and completely ignoring their own laws. Now, that's a terrible thing to do, because sometimes a law gives you credibility. You say, well, we have by law restricted ourselves to behave well, so you can trust us now. You don't have to take our word for it. We passed a law. But when you just simply ignore your own laws, and parliament itself acts in violation of laws that parliament itself has passed, your credibility mechanisms lose credibility. Law is a credibility mechanism. And I think we've seen a lot of that recently. We even had an Inland Revenue Act to actually maintain taxes in a certain stable way that was passed, I can't remember, 2018 or so, that said, look, here's a fair system of taxes and it's entrenched by law, and you can't simply change it by the minister's fiat or government action. But what happened in end of 2019 and 2020 is that law was violated. All the tax cuts happened in contravention of that law. And then later, into about September, Parliament retrospectively made what was previously illegal legal. So they passed a law to retrospectively legalize what the fact that the law had been violated, right? And restored the legality in a retrospective way, but it was a breach of law prior to that. So that kind of behavior, I think, just degrades the credibility of the institution of parliament, of government, of Sri Lanka itself. And you can imagine how much more complicated it makes to go to negotiators, to go to foreign investors, because you can't even promise to abide by your own laws. Why would they, not perceive a very high risk in engaging with you? If I missed a part of the question, please come back and tell me, or just remind me of the rest of the question. Yeah.
I think that's clear. That's very clear. There's a question on this huge construction work going on. They're asking whether there's any expectation of slowing down this big constructions, that government construction, B2B construction, or other projects that are happening at the moment.
So I think, again, it's a choice that we make, right? What is the priority? You do need to cut your budget in some way. And I must tell you that it is important to understand that one of the targets that is likely going to be set for Sri Lanka to demonstrate good behavior requires looking at what you call the primary balance in the budget. So that's different from the budget deficit. You say the budget deficit is the total gap between income and expenditure. The primary deficit is the deficit you have before you pay interest, because interest is such a large component. The first goal is to become non-negative before paying interest. Okay, it's very hard to be non-negative after paying interest. Sri Lanka has done that 4 times in its history. Once in the 1950s, once in the 1990s, but twice between 2015 and 19. I think it may have been 17 and 18 that Sri Lanka ran a positive primary deficit, right? Near zero or near positive primary deficit. So that was quite an achievement. And I think that is really something that we need to try and replicate again in terms of getting Sri Lanka out of the woods and then bring interest costs down, right? Mohan, just repeat the other part of your question.
Is there any possibility of slowing down B2B projects, all these big projects taken out by the...
So now all this spending is part of our costs, right? And I think what I said earlier applies. You really have to ask, what is my priority for expenditure? So I still don't think that cutting expenditure is the fundamental priority for Sri Lanka right now, but knowing where to spend it is more important. So we might decide that the capital investments we are trying to make are a long-term return. and that saving human lives and providing social security is a short-term action. Now, here again, we must be careful not to blame the IMF, because if we go and say, no, we can't stop spending on highways, right? For whatever reason, politicians like spending on highways and they maintain it. We are going to cut our social, we are going to cut the budget deficit and get a primary balance by cutting money to the poorest. Now, that's not the IMF telling you to do that. That's your choice. The IMF will probably look at, as creditors do, your performance on the primary balance. But you have a choice to decide how to cut it. And I would say for Sri Lanka today, we have to look at the return period of investments and focus on short-term stability before we look at long-term returns, especially, and depends on what capital project is. So certain capital projects we know, like say the Mattala airport, probably has much less of a return than the Colombo-Galle highway or the airport Colombo highway. Now, I'm saying that off the top of my head in an impressionistic way, even though there are numbers done out there. But just to point out that we can imagine that there are very different returns to very different capital costs. So once again, I don't want to paint with a broad brush and say we shouldn't undertake capital expenditure. We should be really clear that those capital expenditures have a significant bang for the buck in terms of return. And within a certain time frame, right, that Sri Lanka can count. Because as long as the return to investment is higher than the interest you pay, you're net positive. So debt is not your problem. It's how you invest the debt that is your problem, right? We all know that if you take a debt and invest it to get a higher return than your interest cost, actually it's better to take the debt. But when you invest it in a way that gets you a lower return than your interest, then you're getting yourself into trouble.
Thanks, Doctor. There's another question on Forex. I mean, it's a tricky question. They're asking how long it will take to stabilize the Forex. Would tourist arrival, workers, remittances, is it in isolation whether it solves the problem, or do we need to have a different strategy? I mean, as a government, as a country, do we need to have a different strategy to move ahead with this, the Forex issue?
So, Verite is coming out with an insight, which we've been working on, to show that tourism arrivals does not bring stability to the foreign exchange market. And that's a longer answer. Very briefly, I think we overestimate our tourist incomes. We don't realize that it has to be counted as net, not gross. There's outflows and not just the inflows. And I mean, but very simply, you can look at the past. We had the tourist income. We had pretty much the same dynamics, and when we paid debt, we needed to reborrow. So the answer is none of those things. The answer is regaining access to capital markets. We regain stability when we regain access to capital markets. We get partial stability when we create a debt restructuring conversation, and there's confidence that there's a horizon to this conversation. When people see that this is something that will end in 6 months, or 8 months, that itself will build some confidence and stability. But proper stability comes in, I think, when you regain access and regain the equilibrium. I mean, in any ecosystem, we say that 2% increase in global warming can completely upset the state of the world. You mess with a small, a small number, and create disequilibrium, there's cascading effects. So the disequilibrium we are in right now, by having lost access to capital markets while we are repaying debt, has to be solved. One way to solve is to stop repaying the debt. Okay, that's very important, which is what we should have done some time ago in a negotiated way. We go and ask consent, and that can be done quite quickly with your creditors. Because once you lost that balance, one way to get the balance is get your credit ratings up. The other way to get the balance is stop paying and still stop the outflow. So we really are very late to that game. And I hope we still do it very quickly, because we can't afford to put the pain on society and have people live without power and fuel and standing in queues. This is going to destroy Sri Lanka's GDP. We are going to have a much larger negative GDP this year than we did during COVID. And that's going to just make all the debt dynamics look a great deal worse and coming out of the problem much harder. So Sri Lanka is really heaping misery on itself by the policy choices that it's making.
I think there's sort of as a follow-up question then about the creditors. Anyway, I would think that they already taken the NPV cut. I think the moment that we paid the money back, then there'll be a windfall of gain to them. I think that may be the kind of a choice we would have made earlier. I think, is there any possibility of having that kind of a discussion in future? I mean, even before IMF coming to
let me answer a slightly different question to what you might be asking. Let me tell you why creditors will agree to halt debt payments. Okay, you might think, how can you do that? Why would creditors agree? They agree because Sri Lanka already looks like a high-risk country. And on the secondary market, the Sri Lanka's debt that they have bought, and I'm just going to create fictional numbers here just to give an example. Say, supposing they can get only 60 rupees back to 60 cents back to the dollar of the debt that they hold, right? It has lost value. Now, the problem for them is as follows. If Sri Lanka becomes unable to pay and goes into a disorderly default and isn't able to meet future payments, that 60 cents is going to fall to 30 cents to 20 cents, etc. And their value is going to be wiped out. So when you go and say, look, give us a debt standstill, what you're saying is, look, if you don't give us a debt standstill, we may get into so much trouble that your 60 cents is going to be 30 cents. If you give us a standstill, we negotiate a restructure and you might get 65 cents or even 70 cents, who knows, but we'd like to keep it not too much above 60 because that's all you have right now, but it's better than you going down to 30. So they will agree because that's their way of preserving the value. Even though they have lost value already, they want to protect themselves from losing more value, right? So this is really the negotiating point. And if you go after a disorderly default, it's harder because you don't threaten a much bigger loss in value as you would when you go before a disorderly default. And that is why we should have done it 6 months ago, 1 year ago, because that's when you can really get them to agree that it is better to give Sri Lanka a chance to get back its debt sustainability because they don't lose value in their holdings. So it's a really economic calculation. The guys who own our debt are big hedge funds. Their funds are valued at mark-to-market rates. They are very sophisticated and sensible. It's not an emotional game. They know the way to protect value is give the country the ability to restructure. And they will do it. So I think Sri Lanka just needs to take that step and take it really fast before we keep shutting down our country and destroying our GDP and economy. And I think that's a good place to stop. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. There's a question on low-cost development credits. The question is like this: they're asking whether now. For example, if the country slips from lower middle income to low income country, whether this development, lower cost development credits, whether there's any possibility of accessing to that low cost development credits.
So green bonds, development credits, all these little things that you can do to help you kind of do patchwork solutions and plaster over the situations. These are good things to have. But it would be a mistake to see those as solutions to the bigger problem, right? If you need a surgery, I mean, it helps to take some medication, alleviate your symptoms, but postponing the surgery can make that surgery more serious and more difficult when you have to face up to it. So alleviating symptoms is good. It makes you feel a little comfortable. But if all it does is set you up for a more miserable and difficult surgery in the future, then that's not the way to go. And when I hear people talk about these things, I worry that they are misunderstanding the problem and think that somehow if you do these things, you can muddle along and emerge on the other side with your debt being sustainable. You can't. Sri Lanka is heading on a path that is making things worse, not better. Regaining the credibility of the political system is a first step because there is no way to negotiate stability in your debt and debt stabilization programs without a stable government. Having done that, and while doing that, we really need to move very fast to appoint what you call the restructuring advisors, or these companies, or like your lawyers, who basically do the initial consent solicitation to put a standstill to your debt. I very much hope we do it in April. If we go any further, we just probably need to stop paying, because the economy can't take the pain anymore of taking the little dollars there is and shoveling it off to pay interest. And there are a lot of payments due in May that need to be put on a standstill. And getting on that path the fastest possible way with a credible leadership in your economics team is the best mix for Sri Lanka. None of the other things will move the needle as much as what I have outlined. One, I'm wondering whether our time is up, but if it's not, please let me know and keep going.
Yes. Rasha, I mean, are we okay to proceed, Niroshi?
Yeah, Mohan, we can go for about another 10-15 minutes.
Okay, thanks. There are quite a few questions. Doctor, I will quickly take on. There's a question of, if IMF does not provide the solution, what would be the last resort for us as a country?
I mean, that's a very strange question. Why would we want the IMF to provide the solution? Why there is no last resort? The first resort for the country is for the country to come up with a solution. I mean, I would say it's a very childish mentality for us to have, to think that somebody else from the outside must come and tell us the solution. We must design the solution. We must approach the IMF then to be part of the solution on the plan that we have put together and develop it. We must approach our creditors separately to negotiate a solution. I think we must be adult about this, right? There's somebody else, neither Superman, Batman, nor Santa Claus, nor Grandpa is going to come and solve the problem. We must solve the problem, and we must take responsibility for solving the problem. And that is the first resort, not the last resort.
In that light, as a country, I mean, I think there's finance and accounting fraternity, whole lot that listen to this whole conversation. What's the message from you? I mean, for us to look at what kind of solution? I mean, what will be the things that we have to be mindful? I mean, it could be a very small way, could be like a very minute way, but if we aggregate everything together, there could be a possibility of some easing out this dollar issue, the exchange issue, then interest, and so on and so forth. Doctor, any thoughts on that?
So I think for the fraternity and the financial community, let me tell you one thing, and you started with that when you talked about the problems of accounting and auditing. These problems that budgets are often fictional documents designed to mislead Parliament and the people has been known for a long time. For 5 years at least, we've published reports showing that and done public events and seminars and newspaper articles. It's well known. Verite gives projections on budgetary outcomes that every single year in the last 5 years or 6 have been more accurate and far more accurate than the projections given in the budget itself. That means with the little information we can have, we can still predict budgetary outcomes better, which means that what is given to Parliament and to the public is purposely misleading. I mean, there's no other way to conclude that, right? So I think it is poor governance that gets you into these kinds of difficulties. And if the financial fraternity, the business community is afraid to call out poor governance, afraid to ask for better governance, then they will get what is coming from poor governance. And that's what has happened in Sri Lanka. I can tell you for over 10 years, I've been in budget events and I've gotten up and spoken and been critical of budgets. All 10 years, I've been critical of the budget. And at the same events, business leaders have get up and praise the budget because they want to, have government be, be not upset with them, which I am very sympathetic to that problem. But imagine where it gets you. When you can't exercise your sense of citizenship, of democracy, and ask for the country to be governed better, for more responsible accounting and budgeting. And I think the CA fraternity especially perhaps would like to organize as a fraternity, because it's hard to do that as an individual, right? So maybe Verite and I take certain risks that others don't want to take. But if you organize as a fraternity and say, no, we will not be willing to accept budgets that are patently inaccurate. And we will insist, and we will make it a problem for credibility and legitimacy. If that happens, then you will. And if the government's budgets are violating its own laws of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, that we will stand up against that. I think it takes citizens that are alive to what government is doing to ensure good governance. Good governance doesn't come from heaven either, right? It comes on the basis of active citizenship that is watchful and concerned for what government is doing. So perhaps I think that is some advice I can offer, because and I realize that it is hard to do that, but we are now living the very real cost of perhaps the absence of better governance for our country.
Thanks, Dr. Sorry, there's another few questions. I thought if I'll quickly throw it at you. They're asking, are we heading for the hyperinflation at this moment? Whether the people start or the inflation start chasing wages, and it's like a cycle that we are getting into. Are we heading for that hyperinflation at the moment?
So we are potentially heading into a lot of bad things, but they don't have to happen. We can stop them. So let's get rid of the word hyper and say extreme inflationary cycle, which is when the wage price feedback comes in, right? So once you have to increase wages because people can't survive, or dollar offers are competing with your wages. So many people outsourcing from other countries. It's very easy to hire workers on outsource basis. Say in the IT industry, you have to compete with the dollar value of people's salaries. And so people might actually have to increase wages. That increases prices, that increases the feedback. And when that inflation feedback happens, it can entrench your inflation and take it up quite a lot. So there are devices to do that. And one of the devices, of course, is to prevent the spiraling depreciation in the ways that I said, right? Reduce the shortage, build the confidence and expectations. On interest rates, it may require also increasing interest rates on the local side, even though that does create a higher cost to government for its debt. So, these things, there is no easy way out. Because ideally the government would like to keep interest rates low so that it has a lower cost on debt. But then, and inflation helps the debt management for government, but extreme inflation also is quite negative from a GDP perspective. So has to be managed, I think, into a reasonable level. And interest rates is one of the instruments that the government has to do that, alongside building confidence, alongside creating reducing the shortage of dollars and depreciation. So all I want to say is that we have seen the rest of the world, we've seen bad things happen, and usually we say, okay, that happens only in my TV, right? In Lebanon, surely that we tend to think that certain things happen only in African countries and in your television. But what we are seeing in Sri Lanka over the last many decades, I'm beginning to see, is that the things we thought were only in TV are beginning to happen here. The unimaginable can happen, but it is also avoidable. I want to say that very clearly, that these are not unavoidable things. It is policy actions, repeated decisions taken, at various points in time that got us here. And taking the right decisions even now can help us reverse in a reasonable amount of time. And we should really focus on making sure that the right decisions are taken quickly for Sri Lanka at this time.
Thanks, Doctor. There's a question. It's very critical at the moment, but I thought if I'll ask this question from you. There's a question saying, general public saying that politicians have robbed the money. Are there any method to verify this thing? I mean, is there any mechanism to quantify this kind of a scenario at the moment?
there are ways to figure that out, and there are several ways. I mean, for instance, people have studied, Morato University have published studies on the cost of Sri Lankan highways. And I've read certain documents and things put out in the public domain that said Sri Lanka paid more per kilometer of highways sometimes than even a European country did, where it is much higher, but I haven't dug deep into those studies. So there are certainly ways to look at the cost of infrastructure and look at the gap between what a reasonable cost is and what is not, and look at competitive market prices. So you can really look at, where Sri Lanka lost value, and who took that value is a different question, because maybe the costs are high due to bad planning and bad design. It doesn't have to be all corruption. But I think, on this corruption side, Sri Lanka needs a corruption fighting institution that's independent of political control. Hong Kong, Singapore, two simple examples, they made a big turnaround when they built an institution that politicians could not control and influence, that was credible and fought corruption. So yes, I think, tackling political corruption is important. There are institutional structures that can do it. Again, the public demand has been inadequate for something like that. So our corruption busting institution, CBOC, is hugely vulnerable to political influence and control. And if politicians choose to give it independence, it has, and if not, it doesn't. And that won't do. So I think in any reform process going forward, we need a corruption busting institution that's fit for purpose. We mustn't trust a good politician to fight corruption. That's not a sustainable, viable path for tackling corruption. We must trust a good institutional structure and get these initial appointments to that structure correct if we are to get corruption under control in Sri Lanka. And the problem of corruption, like the problem of inflation, seems to have been galloping along and needs to be pulled back quite substantially to help the country's future economic success.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. I think there's a power changeover happened this moment. Very quickly, there's a questions they're asking. You can take a worst case scenario as well as a best case scenario for us to get on to a corrections, stage of correction, whatever, with the strategy at the moment, whatever the strategy that we follow, IMF and other things that at the moment, what kind of a timelines we are looking at for us to be, maybe you can think of what the extreme cases and the best case and the stress case or other worst case, what kind of a timeline we are looking at for us to get out from this whole misery, I would think, having at the moment.
So great question. I will do it with case studies, and I'll do the best and worst. Ecuador, Argentina, let's take Ecuador, one of the best in the very recent past, I think within 4 to 5 months, from appointing the debt restructuring advisors, immediate consent solicitation to suspend debt payments, and then within 4 months or so, an agreement on debt restructuring, credit ratings go back up, and they're looking at a short space of time in which they can get access to financial markets. So it was a great example of executing a debt restructuring. I'm not saying Ecuador overall over its history is a great example. It has had many problems in the past, but in this particular instance, they executed that restructuring process really well. Of course, IMF was also present in providing a separate program of assistance, and likewise. On the other extreme, you have Zambians, let's take Suriname and Zambia. They got into debt problems. They didn't have a stable government. They didn't have a proper institutional structure for negotiation, therefore found it difficult. They have just continued and continued being in default and unable to solve the problem. Suriname, right? So really, I think political stability is critical in thinking of the timeline. If you had asked me this question 3 months ago, I would have said Sri Lanka can do it in 6 months, and we know how to do it, and we should. Today, I will tell you, we probably are looking at a certain window in which we have to first fix the political stability. But get the initial suspension of debt going immediately. And after having suspended the debt, we can start the negotiations, but it's hard to proceed without a credible, stable government. So, we may need to look at a 3-month period, if it is elections, whatever it is, given what the streets look like, to give confidence that to our creditors, the IMF, that Sri Lanka has a government supported by the people, and fully supported and able to represent the people. And that will then, you probably have another 4 or 5 months from there, if you've made some progress before that, to get the debt restructuring sorted. So I think, we are still looking at a 6 to 9 month period from where we stand today in a best case scenario for Sri Lanka. The worst case scenario is we have this conversation 2 years later and we are still in the same place. And
yeah, I hope that would be the point. Doctor, there are other questions. I think most of the questions we answered, I think different format shape, these are same on the same line. Niroshi, can I hand it over to you? I think most of the questions that on the chat options, one form or shape, we have answered. I think Doctor has answered all these questions. Niroshi, can I hand it over the session to you?
Yeah, thanks, Mahan. So thank you, Dr. Demel. You had a very tight schedule this week, yet you conducted this very informative discussion for our CA members. It was indeed a stimulating discussion. So a big thank you for Dr. Nishan Demel and Mr. Mohan Tantrike. Thank you. So thank you for all our participants for joining us this evening and engaging in this discussion actively. Stay safe and good night.
thank you so much. Yeah, take care.
Thank you.